Chips are a big deal, but Masa has taken it to another level and their popularity is skyrocketing. And I'm excited to visit with co-founder and CEO Stephen, the Really Tan Man, as we discuss not only Masa, but the state of processed foods and a look at the future. Stephen, also known as the Really Tan Man, I'm so glad that you took the time to visit with us, brother. Came across you because you have an amazing story with being a food entrepreneur. I think that's such an important part of being healthy and overcoming. And so me as a grocery store owner, you as someone that I'm proud to have your product stocking my shelf with Masa, thought it was a really good time to come together and talk about why do we do this? What is the reason behind the blood, sweat, and tears of being in this industry, right? So Absolutely. If you will, give us that brief introduction, brother, to who you are, and then we'll dive into a lot of topics.
Well, thanks, Logan. Happy to be here. My name is Stephen. I am the co-founder and CEO of Ancient Crunch. We make tallow fried snacks, notably Masa chips, which are organic corn tortilla chips fried in beef tallow, and recently Vandy Crisps, which are similarly organic potato chips also fried in beef tallow.
And they're delicious.
That's the best part. Yeah.
That is. I think the spicy one, just like I eat way too much of those. So I got to be real careful when I open a bag. So what made you start that? Why in the world would you start a chip company?
Yeah, well, I think it's a good point. The delicious part is actually a good place to start. Health foods have a big problem in America, or like American foods have a big problem because Americans think that foods fall into two categories. There's junk food that tastes good, but it's bad for you and you feel guilty about eating it. And then there's health food, which may be good for you, but it doesn't taste good and you resent having to eat it. And so Americans are sort of caught between a rock and a hard place where they can eat the things they like and poison themselves, or eat the things they don't like and care about their health. And I don't think that is the right way of looking at it. I don't think that's true. You don't have to make that sacrifice. You don't have to give up one or the other. You can have things that are delicious and they can also be good for you. Notably, traditional foods that we've been making for centuries or millennia typically meet both those categories, right? If a recipe, imagine how hard it is for humans to exist and survive, like in history. The recipes that get passed down are going to be the best of the best, the cream of the crop. Only the things that are most useful, both in terms of taste and in terms of nutrition, are the ones that are going to get handed down to us. And so honing in on those traditional recipes is where you can find foods that satisfy both requirements. They're healthier and many times healthier than even the health foods that people think of as are being good for you, like the kale chips and the smoothies and whatever. They're healthier than those things, and they're more delicious than the cheap, crappy junk foods that we've been fed for the past 70 years. So Masa chips in particular were invented because I had a friend who was basically in this situation. He working hard, 80 hours a week at his finance job, didn't have time to care about health, didn't have time to cook like nourishing things. And I caught him eating Tostitos one day, just like start lecturing him about seed oils. And he's like, dude, I worked in software at the time, which is a relatively easy job, or it was then actually. But that's all a separate story. I'm like, he's like, I can't cook like you. I can't go to the farmer's market. I can't buy all this stuff. I can't do any of this. So like, I can't be healthy. And I'm like, doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be that way. Right? Like anything that comes in a package, like why should it be poison? And I start sort of telling him about like how if I were making a tortilla chip, it would look like this and look like, it'd have tallow and it'd have organic nixtamalized corn, yada, yada, yada. So he basically challenges me to go make it. It doesn't exist, go make it. And in my spare time, I did. And then a few months later, we started selling them. Me and he is my business partner today. And we've been doing that for about 2.5 years now.
Wow, I didn't realize that it was that new, that you had been doing this. Again, they are so good, but let's talk about the ingredients that you use and the price point and why that's something that we have to have a conversation around, right? Because we have gotten so used to cheap food, like, and I would call it food like substances.
Oh yeah.
But we're so used to inexpensive food. So why is the ingredients that you decided to use matter, and why is the price point going to be substantially different than a bag of the run of the mill chips?
Yeah, for sure. The headline ingredient, of course, is the beef tallow. So in the 1950s, I'm sure the audience here is probably going to be familiar with this, but no harm in doing a quick rundown. In the 1950s, the traditional fats that we'd always used since the dawn of time, lard, butter, beef tallow, they were replaced with vegetable oils after much propaganda and much spending by the vegetable oil companies, and Americans just stopped eating them. And so in the ensuing 70 years, we've seen every possible chronic disease increase by several orders of magnitude. Things that didn't even exist, like there weren't even case studies of heart attacks occurring prior to the early 1900s. Things that just never even existed became ubiquitous in the modern day. And seed oils are a big part of it, right? 20 to 25% of all calories consumed in America are seed oils. It's a lot. It's probably more than any other single source of calories that we eat. And for a quarter of all your calories to be poison, that's pretty bad, right? And so the main innovation, if you will, not that we invented anything. I mean, these recipes are hundreds of years old. These techniques are, have been around since the dawn of time. But rather bringing it back, the main thing that we had to do was use beef tallow, which is the primary frying fat. It always has been. French fries were invented in the 1800s in Belgium, and it was potatoes fried in beef tallow. McDonald's, famously, their French fries spread across the country on the back of the cows whose tallow they were fried in. Because it's delicious, it's healthy, it gets the job done, it satisfies you. And only in the second half of the 20th century were those fats pulled out right from under us, and no one even knew. No one even knew the difference, or no one even could tell the difference. McDonald's famously still adds like beef extract into their frying oil, so that they can still kind of mimic that classic taste. So yeah, beef tallow is the main frying fat, and there's plenty of virtues of beef tallow other than the fact that it's not a seed oil. It has a high vitamin content, fat soluble vitamins like vitamin A, vitamin K2, conjugated linoleic acid, CLA is another one. Vitamin D also. And I'm sure a billion other things that are as yet unknown to the biochemists who have yet to figure them out. So yeah, we threw beef tallow back in, and that's a big one. That's obviously it's like 3 to 5 times the price of seed oils, depending on where you get it and whatever. So that's one. It's not produced in massive quantities, which is a big contributor to why it's so expensive. But yes, there's beef tallow, and then for Masa chips, of course, there's organic corn, which is very important because corn is widely grown in America, but 90% plus of corn is not organic, and it's GMO, pesticide laden, whatever. Glyphosate, of course, is popular to talk about, but it's not the only one. There's atrazine is another horribly toxic substance that's banned in pretty much every other civilized country. That's just sprayed wholesale on corn. It's a nightmare out there. So of course it had to be organic corn. And of course, we had to prepare it in the way that, the Aztecs who invented corn agriculture, prepared corn, which involves, it's called nixtamalization. This is the process of turning corn into like tortillas, similar to how sourdough, like when you sourdough ferment bread, it breaks down some of the anti-nutrients and makes it more digestible and all these virtues. Nixtamalization accomplishes a similar effect with corn. You boil corn with basically crushed up limestone, calcium hydroxide. And by doing that, you kill mycotoxins that may be there. You loosen the hard to digest cellulose so that it washes away, increases the bioavailability of certain nutrients and a whole host of other beneficial processes. And when you do that, you grind it up into a flour or into a paste, and that's corn dough. That's it's actually called masa in Spanish, hence the name Masa chips. You flatten it out, cook it, and they're cut into circles, and that's a tortilla. And so we take that, chop it into 6 pieces, and then we fry them, and then that's what goes in the bag. That's pretty much it.
That's incredible. It seems simple, but I know that so much more goes into building it out. So let's talk a little bit about scaling. something where you're focused so much on the ingredients, right? Because I think that's where we sometimes give people a pass on not using things, the better ingredients, because it's more expensive or it's more difficult, it's more challenging. So
Yeah.
how have you been able to navigate that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll give you an example. The short answer is ruthless commitment to nothing fake, but it's not always so easy. So an example of this is our lime chip. After we had Masa Original, we got requests for all sorts of different flavors. And I'm honestly a flavor purist. I'm a very simple man. To this day, like 98% of my Masa consumed is original or blue corn, which is just seasoned with salt. But people wanted a lime chip, and lime, you'd think, okay, that's easy. Every company has a lime flavor. Tostitos got lime, even the healthy ones. Siete's got lime. Late July's got lime. That shouldn't be too hard, right? Wrong. Boy, was I wrong. We designed the color, the bags, printed it all up, and it was like, all right, time to figure out this whole lime recipe. So I started looking for lime powder. Couldn't find anything that was pure. Everything was like lime juice powder. All of it had maltodextrin. Or only organic lime powder also had maltodextrin or other sort of like weirdo additives. There's stuff with citric acid in it, yada, yada, yada. And I start looking into this and I'm like, what the hell? Why can't I find any lime powder vendors? And I go and look at the ingredient labels of all the other lime chips, the healthy ones, for inspiration. And I found out that none of them use like just lime. It's lime plus citric acid. It's lime plus maltodextrin. It's lime plus something else. Siete, for example, uses lime essential oil plus citric acid. So the lime essential oil gives it the aromatics, the flavor of lime, and the citric acid makes it sour. Of course, citric acid is 95% of it is all manufactured in China from like GMO'd black mold, literally in like these bioreactors that produce citric acid as a byproduct of whatever you feed them, which is disgusting. And maltodextrin is just this weird, it's like, whose grandma has maltodextrin in her cupboard? Right? Have you ever met a grandma with maltodextrin in the cupboard? And I'm like, if it's not in your grandma's cupboard, I'm not using it. So we were like, how the hell do we, so we can't buy lime powder. We have these bags, we print them up. We have to go make lime somehow. So we just decided to like buy limes and buy a bunch of dehydrators and started slicing the limes in our factory. And then dehydrating them, grinding them into a powder, and then sprinkle that on the chips. And that's what we did for the longest time. And then, of course, that's super labor intensive, and dehydrating is like, it's not high heat, but it's not nothing. It's like 105 degrees. And so it started to cause a little bit of oxidation in the lime. So the powder would, like the limes would kind of turn a little brown. And so the powder had this very tan color, which doesn't make sense because lime should be green. So then I figured out, oh, wait, I can just freeze dry limes instead. But then freeze dryers are expensive as hell. In case anyone's ever looked into this, they'll know. Freeze dryers are pretty intense equipment. We fortunately found a freeze drying company that we compelled to buy organic limes for us, and they would grind it up and freeze dry it, and then turn that into a powder. And so then that was easy for a time, and that worked. But there was a complaint still. People were like saying, "Hey, this is bitter," right? It's real limes. Limes have a bitter undertone. But what we managed to find this guy out of South Africa who invented this machine that slams limes against the wall at like a very high speed, so fast that the sort of cell walls of the lime, like it grinds it up so fine that the cell walls kind of break apart and all the juices fully come out and are exposed. And so then we found this guy with that machine, and then you take that lime slurry, basically smashed up limes, and then we turned that into a powder. And then that's our latest and hopefully final iteration of this lime escapade. And I'm not kidding, like we haven't even launched this yet. That's coming out in probably, like we're waiting for the first shipments to arrive. That's probably a few weeks out from now. But like it's been 2 years of us trying to do limes, and still we haven't found like an easy way to do it. And we've been constantly like trying to improve it either for efficiency or taste or whatever. So obviously that's one ingredient and one flavor, but I think it's illustrative of the fact that it's like, it's that difficult, or it can be that difficult. Don't even get me started on having to do salt and vinegar chips, or like sour cream or anything with cheese. Like we're working on it, and like still, we still haven't been able to finally fix this yet. But yeah, so like that's why you have the healthy brands. Like they don't want to do this. They can't do this. They're not like committed to the bit enough, as they say. And so they end up doing the citric acid and the lime oil and all this craziness. But yeah, no, it's really hard. Lime powder is our most expensive single ingredient by weight. It's like $40 a pound, which is insane because we have that spicy flavor you're mentioning, the habanero chilies. The habanero spice is like, it's this pepper that's grown in this one tiny little province of Guatemala by these people that have been doing it for like thousands of years, you know, in the same exact way. That spice is like $17 a pound. And it's like this obscure, tiny scale, small scale production thing. Lime is just so expensive. And it's like, these are the types of things where it's like, that's what goes into this. And so that's why if you want to do things the right way, you end up having to invent new supply chains, and doing anything of that sort, of course, requires a lot of money. And because it's made at such small quantities, the unit costs have not come down, right? And so you end up having to pay a lot and therefore charge a lot.
Wow. Yeah, I think that does illustrate why it is so challenging. You know, a couple different directions I want to go, but I actually want to go down the Siete path with you, because
sure.
you actually put something on Instagram where you were kind of taken up for them, is at least the way I read it, because a lot of pushback, right? Like a lot of pushback of selling out to Pepsi, and so I wanted to give you the opportunity to maybe just go into a little bit more of that on how you view another brand, another quote unquote competitor selling out.
It's a good question. How do I go about this? So people see, when you're the consumer, you see the product, you see the marketing, you see the photos on Instagram, you see it on a shelf, but you don't see anything about what goes on behind the scenes, right? Like no one knows about this whole lime escapade that we did, and every company has their versions of this. But a common thing that all companies have to deal with is, how do you pay for it all, right? You have to buy a lot of infrastructure to create a new product or business. You have to buy machinery, or if you're not manufacturing yourself, you have to like stand up a marketing team. You have to pay all these people salaries. You got to do a whole bunch of stuff and spend a whole bunch of money, but you're small. You don't have money. So how do you do that? Well, you raise money from investors, and pretty much every company that's ever started on Earth has had some outside capital. Obviously, everyone knows about the tech in the VC world and the investors in Facebook and Google and all this stuff. But even in CPG, in snack foods, it's the same situation. And so Siete is an illustrative example, I think. And they were one of the better ones. Like relative to how big they were, they did not raise very much money. But even still, they sold, I think, I don't exactly know, but I have some pretty good estimates. They sold between 25 and 40% of their business to get to the size that they were by the time they were sold to PepsiCo. And the point of the implication of this is that when you have so many investors, and in particular, if you give them so much control, which is pretty standard, right? Even though they own 20%, they have a lot of say on the board and how things are run. Those investors want a payout. And the only real way to get a payout, well, there's two ways, right? You can eventually, the company can make so much money that it can pay back the investors and everyone's happy, which sounds nice. And obviously that's the dream. But for many businesses, if they don't charge enough money for their products, they'll never have enough profit to actually pay off their investors. So that's one way, make enough profit, pay off your investors, or sell to a big company and then everyone gets paid all at once and everyone's happy. So in Siete's case in particular, their unit economics are not incredible. They have like 40% gross margins on around 400 million in revenue at the time they were sold. They're making maybe $30 million in profit at the end of the day. And they sold for what? $1.2 billion. So if you were to like save up enough money from your profits of $30 million a year to have enough money to pay back your investors who own 20% of your company at a $1.2 billion valuation, that's, what is that? That's like, you need $2.4 billion. How long is it going to take? How many years is it going to take for you to make $2.4 billion if you're bringing in $30 million a year? A long time, right? Not going to happen. So if those investors wanted to pay out and they have the ability to influence the board, which they do, the only thing they're going to push for, if someone's willing to buy them, is to make them sell. I mean, I'm sure the Siete family is quite happy, and I can't speak to their personal, whether they wanted to sell or not, or this or that. However, the decision at the end of the day comes down to the investors in like 90% of cases. And so if the investors need you to sell, you sell. Whether they're happy about it, I don't know. But alas, that is the world we live in. And so in my post that you mentioned on Instagram, I explained this and I talked about like an alternative way. And of course, the alternative way is, imagine if Siete at their $400 million in revenue were making $100 million a year, or $200 million a year or something. If they were that profitable and they had sold, the more profits they have and the less of their business they have to sell, the less likely it is that they need to have taken so much outside money that they won't be able to pay it back and they'll have to sell the business. And so there's kind of two ways to run this. There's the raise a bunch of money and then have to sell your company to pay the investors, or raise less money and make more money so that you can pay back whoever needs to be paid back and you never have to sell the business. The latter option, of course, is more difficult. You have to charge higher prices. You have to get by with less outside money. That's the path that we're doing. And it's the path that because people obviously ask me, like, I have no ambitions to sell my company to PepsiCo or whoever. But it's not exactly easy. And it's like all these financial dynamics at play that go on behind the scenes that customers never see or realize that lead to the reactions that they have. So could Siete have done anything else? Probably. It could they have done any other outcome? Unlikely. From the beginning, once they set up their pricing and their production and raised the money that they raised, there's not really any other world in which they could have gotten out without selling the company, basically. And I don't think all hope is lost. I'll say this. Big companies buy brands because people like those brands. And if you go in and change those brands, people will stop liking them. I doubt PepsiCo will change the recipes. Not that as I mentioned with the lime oil thing, I'm not a huge fan of the recipes anyway. But I doubt PepsiCo will go in and change their recipes anytime soon. Could it happen in 10 years? Possibly. Could it happen in 50 years? Most likely. However, at the same time, instead of paying the Siete family whenever you buy a bag of their stuff, you're not paying PepsiCo. And, if your feelings about PepsiCo are how I imagine most of the audience listening to this feelings are, they probably are not happy about doing that, even if the product stays the same.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, for me, Siete will not be on my shelves anymore, but that's more room for Masa. So
yeah, works for me.
It's all going to work out, one way or another. What do you think on, let's say, Kennedy comes in and actually is able to do different regulations or roll back or make a change in food. What do you think that is going to look like? Are we going to have some unintended consequences of changing a behemoth of a system, or is it a opportunity for a lot of positive change? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh boy. Yeah. That's a loaded one. It's funny. I've been working for the past few days. I got this like bug in my head to go write down everything I would do if I controlled the federal government and would just change food policy. It's turned into basically a book. It's like several tens of thousands of words at this point. I have a lot of these things. Short answer is there's a lot that the federal government can do. It's interesting. People pay a lot of attention to federal elections and federal politics, but what the feds do does not actually impact most people's lives most of the time. As bad as things are when you look at Twitter or social media or whatever, have things really changed for anyone that much? Yes, obviously they have changed something, but over the 8, 5, 10, whatever year time frame, things that the federal government do don't really affect you on a very personal level. However, what the federal government's role in food is actually very significant, and what they do does and can change what everyone experiences in their day-to-day life. So a few things that I think could be done that are reasonable. And one very obvious one is the farm subsidies. So since World War II, the federal government has subsidized the growing of various crops, in particular the GMO corn, the GMO soy, all the big cash crops. And so these farmers can produce and sell their ingredients at a cost that's lower than what it would be if there was no subsidies. And so they appear cheap on shelf to the American consumer, but what the American consumer does not realize is that they paid for that cheapness in their tax dollars. So yes, while Frito-Lay looks cheap, you're paying however many cents per bag in your taxes, in the aggregate. And there's a whole bunch of other policies that the government does that favors, big food production. So for example, ending the farm subsidies, or even better, subsidizing small farmers or farmers who grow organic crops or regenerative farming. There you go. There's something. And that could definitely be done. That's like the USDA can do that with a stroke of a pen. It's not that big of a deal. Obviously, certain lobbyists will not be too happy about it. However, it can be done. Another example of this is grass-fed meat. Everyone wants grass-fed tallow, grass-fed beef, grass-fed this. There's an issue in the 1990s where cattle farmers, like big factory farmers, were feeding their cattle chicken poop, basically. Chicken pellets, a combination of like the feathers and poop and dust and whatever else that was scraped off the floor of the chicken factories. That was going into the cattle feed. And what did it do to the cows? It made them sick, obviously. And one of the illnesses it caused is mad cow disease, which people are, largely familiar with. What did the government do in response to the outbreak of mad cow disease? You might think they would have just banned chicken pellets as feed, right? No, of course, you'd be wrong. They instead they figured out that like, only older cows will develop mad cow disease or something. So they mandated that cows for USDA slaughter must be slaughtered before they're like 3 years old. It's like 33 months, but whatever, 3 years old. So, okay, whatever, young cows, who cares? The problem is that when you feed cows grass, it takes them a long time to grow to maturity. And so 3 years is not enough time for a grass-fed rancher to really like fatten up their animals, because grass is not as calorie dense as the corn and soy that the factory farmers use to feed their cows. So what this policy does is it makes anyone who's trying to raise grass-fed animals, it makes those animals lower quality and taste, and it makes them smaller, so they're less profitable. And it actively discourages financially farmers from raising grass-fed animals, because if you're a rancher, you want your cows to be big at slaughter, you want the meat to taste good, and neither of those things are achieved in grass feeding on a cow that's slaughtered under 3 years. So that's a big issue, and it means that a lot of farmers who otherwise would be doing grass-fed can't. And this is in part the reason why there's no like fancy steakhouse in America that has grass-fed meat. Grass-fed beef is popular among like the hipster restaurants and like the health people, but like all those like $4 sign steakhouses in New York or whatever other big city, they're all conventionally raised corn, fat, and beef, because that's what they want. They want the fat, they want the marbling, and you could achieve that through grass feeding, but you can't if the cows are slaughtered before they're 3 years old. You would need like 4, 5, 6. I mean, in Italy, you can find like 7-year-old. In Spain, you can buy steak from like 7-year-old cattle. And it's incredible. It's like super deep red, fat's super nutrient dense. They've been eating grass for like almost a decade. So yeah, that's another policy that the USDA could just change with the stroke of a pen. All right, no more age restriction, or 5 years or whatever. And that would make it a lot easier for grass-fed farmers to compete. That's another one. Let's see. I mean, I have a lot of these, so I don't know how far you want to get into. I will say this, though, about federal policy. There is an issue, though, with the, will it actually work? Here's a story. When sometime in the 90s, early 2000s, I think, the government was like, cars are too big. They're too wasteful of gas. We should discourage, low fuel efficiency cars. So we're going to mandate certain fuel efficiency requirements for cars. Naturally, the bigger a car is, the more fuel it burns. And so the fuel efficiency standards changed based on the weight class of the car. If your car was heavier, you were allowed to produce a lower fuel efficiency car. So what happened? Did manufacturers start making more efficient cars? No, they just made bigger cars so they could get the higher fuel efficiency, benchmark without violating the regulation. And if you look at pictures of the pickup trucks, for example, or even in the 80s, most cars were, station wagons or sedans. Now most cars are pickup trucks or SUVs. Cars got bigger, and therefore, because cars are bigger, they're, harder on the roads. So roads have to get repaired more frequently, which costs money and takes energy. They burn more gas and all this stuff. And so what the government ended up doing is they wanted to incentivize smaller, more efficient cars, but they just simply created a market for bigger cars. And now we're not any better off as far as fuel efficiency is concerned than we were however long ago. I'm not saying that big trucks are necessarily bad. However, the point of this example is to illustrate how when you have an idea and you try to impose this through, some kind of regulation or restriction, the people who have financial stake in the matter have much more time to spend being creative about getting around your laws and finding loopholes than you do in being able to create loophole-proof legislation. And so it's not always so obvious that you can just like pass a law or pass a tax or make a tariff or whatever that could, end seed oils or something like this. Obviously, there's a lot that can be done, and I mentioned a few of them. A seed oil tax would be interesting, or like cigarette style seed oil warning labels or warning labels on seed oils, like this can cause whatever. That could be something. However, it's hard to predict the unintended consequences of regulations of this sort.
Yeah. One issue around the regulations is going to be like raw milk. Yeah. And so like we recently had a run-in health department over raw milk and stuff.
Oh boy.
But earlier today, David Grumpet was on. He wrote the Raw Milk Revolution. He's one of the originals in creating the awareness around this, and he had some pretty interesting takes on that. So, like, what do you see as the role of regulations? How can there be that, for lack of a better term, a happy medium? How can we not go too far, but how do we roll it back to where there's still some common sense? Is there a way to do that? And is there a way to do that for everybody? Or does there have to be different categories from the small scale to large scale?
Yeah. This is a great question. So on the scale point, bigger entities can and should be treated differently than smaller ones. For example, if you are a small, high-quality rancher and you care about your animals and you're out there with the pasture every single day or whatever, does the USDA need to come in and say, like, yell at you about how much bleach you're using to disinfect this or that? Like, no, probably not. However, if you have thousands of cows in a warehouse, you bet your ass that you need someone to tell you that you have to keep this clean. It's similar to a similar example, or maybe an easy example of this is like littering. Can I throw an apple core out the side of my open window while I'm driving down the street into the woods? Yeah, sure. Some squirrel will eat it. It's so small relative to the size of its surrounding ecosystem that nature will just do its thing and it won't affect anything. However, can I dump 10,000 apple cores on the side of the road? No, obviously. Like, that will create who knows what disruptions in the local ecosystem. And maybe apple cores are innocuous, but still, the point stands. When you do stuff on a bigger scale, you have to do things differently. And the regulations should absolutely reflect that. And they actually kind of do, right? Like I was saying about the grass-fed beef thing. The regulations help the big guys. They make it easier for them because it actually gives them guidelines on how to have clean and safe and no mad cow disease and whatever. But does a small scale farmer who doesn't feed their cows chicken poop need to be told to slaughter their animals before 3 years old? No, right? So the problem is that we have regulations that basically discriminate against small producers and they favor big producers. Of course, that's by design because the big producers have lobbying money and they get these rules passed that favor them. But so if it can work that way, though, it could also work the other way, right? Why not? And some states have this, and this is a good example, like cottage laws, where let's say I bake sourdough bread and I bake like 10 loaves a week and sell them at my farmer's market. Like if this were the conventional food setup, I would have to go to a commercial kitchen and with like a permit and license and health inspection, all this stuff, just to bake my 10 loaves of bread and sell them at the farmer's market. And that's too costly. I'm only selling 10 loaves of bread. I can't pay for all this. So I'm just not going to do it. Cottage laws are rules that a lot of states adopt. And I actually think the USDA should make, federal standardization that say, if you're selling below a certain amount of something, bread is a good example, you can make it in your home, sell it at the farmer's market. No one's going to like come knocking on your door. But if you start selling 1,000 or 100, 1,000, 10,000 loaves of bread, then you're going to need to get a commercial kitchen. You're going to need to get health inspection. You're going to need to get all this stuff. So cottage laws are a good example of something that's beneficial for the small guy because it allows people to start stuff without expending a ton of money. And if it starts succeeding, then cool. By that point, you have enough money to pay for whatever health and safety stuff that you need. So I think it's totally possible to create regulations that enable the success of small entities and yet also keep bigger entities in check and doing the right thing. And that, I think, is the general philosophical approach to these kind of regulations that makes the most sense. So yeah, I forget, you had like 2 questions in there. Did I answer that? Or
Yeah, no, I think that's just how can you have regulations that are, I mean, I am typically much more libertarian in my approach of just like let people go. Like it just my big thing on, I understand the scalability, but when you look at like the food recalls and everything, it's inevitably always the big guys, right? It's a big time scale. It's not the farmer, right? That was selling raw milk. And I think that if we don't have local decentralized food systems, we don't truly have resiliency. And so when we have this nonsense regulations on people that are doing things right, like I don't think any farmer I know is like, oh, I'm going to cut corners and make people sick. Like nobody's doing that. Like them, you know where they live.
That's another great thing. So yeah, that's a good point. So there are a lot of regulations we have that were invented in times that are very different from ours today that might have made sense when they were invented. Raw milk is a perfect example. Raw milk pasteurization laws came into effect before the mass adoption of refrigeration technology everywhere. Refrigerators were invented, but they were not in every house, in every store, in every truck, right? Like, so the issue was that people, because you didn't have refrigeration, you had to produce milk close to where you were going to sell it because you had to sell it within a day or two, right? It's fresh milk. It can't be kept cold. Not even a day or two, like every day. And so in the like late 1800s and the early 1900s in New York City, there were dairy farms in Manhattan and Brooklyn. They were in the city. And that's where people who lived there got their milk because it had to be there, the day of. There was not enough time to transport something from Pennsylvania or New Jersey over to the city. So pasteurization may have helped because the conditions of those dairies in Manhattan were very unsanitary. Obviously, the milk got infected. Certainly, they should have been taking better care of the cows, but at a certain point, like you can't raise cows in a freaking city, So pasteurization was not a perfect solution, but a solution that solved the problem at that time and in that place. But now refrigeration is available everywhere. Stainless steel exists. Stainless steel did not exist in 1856 or whatever, Stainless steel exists. Sanitation exists. Running water exists, right? You can wash your stuff with cleaning materials that produce a sterile surface relatively easily. You can then put your sterile milk in a refrigerator and transport it somewhere and have someone consume it within 2-3 weeks and it's still fine. None of that existed back then. And so we have the technology that like completely invalidates the need for any of these regulations, right? Like no one's making milk in New York City anymore. But the law never changed. And that's in part because once you legalize and like legislate the existence of a new industry, namely the pasteurization industry, they will fight to remain legally mandated. Because if raw milk were widely adopted, you would not have need for these giant pasteurization plants, and those business owners would lose their companies or lose money. And so they lobby to prevent that from happening. Another good example of this, of how technology has changed the need for these regulations is the internet. If you were some farmer, right, or you raised dairy cattle in New York City, and you sold it over here and then someone got sick and they complained, like no one would know about it. People forget about it 2 weeks later, go sell it in a different neighborhood of Manhattan, change the name of your business or whatever. And then it's fine. You have no consequences. Or like the consolidation of the meat industry in the late 1800s, people, slaughtering meat in Chicago, shipping it off to New York or whatever. They're in no way accountable for anything that happens in New York City. The people buying it in New York City don't even know who made it, And so you have the need for something like the USDA to come in and make sure the people in Chicago are doing the right job so that no one in New York City gets sick. However, we have the internet, we have Google reviews, we have Facebook, we have Twitter. Like if someone's doing bad stuff or if someone's making milk that makes me sick or meat that makes me sick, I can go leave a bad review. I can go make a stink about it. And so there's like this sort of imposed higher standard of action because there's more social responsibility imposed by the transparency of the internet. Because of that, there's not as much need for a lot of regulations, right? Your local small farmer who's screwing everyone over but can get away with it because of whatever in the past can't get away with it anymore. And so you have this sort of self-policing mechanism, and that does a better job than the USDA coming in anyway, whatever do, because it actually creates the desire for people to do the right thing as opposed to merely having to check a box because someone is saying you better do this or we'll shut you down. So I'm sure there are a billion other examples of this, but definitely refrigeration and, you know, production equipment, generally transportation, and the internet and the transparency it produces result in a lot of laws that are basically outdated that should be fixed. And honestly, they can just get rid of them. You know, get rid of, like, that's a regulation. You know, you mentioned you're libertarian. Raw milk is pasteurized milk is a regulation. Delete it. You know, snip, cut it out. And then the problem will solve itself because the farmers have the tools to make it work. Obviously, that's not true of all of the laws, and that's not the right approach for everything. In other cases, it's better for the government to just make stuff illegal. Like, this is another issue, right? In the same way that technology has changed, allowing us to do stuff better than we did in the past, technology has also changed to allow us to do stuff worse than we did in the past. People often like to say, oh, stuff is so much cheaper today, yada, yada, yada. Stuff's not cheaper, it's just worse, right? It's just worse to such a point that no one would have even done it, you know, 100 years ago. Houses are cheap. This is a good example. It's like 2x4s and drywall and whatever, like, can blow away in the wind. Like, the like drywall and vinyl siding and the other crappy materials that modern houses are made of literally did not exist 100 years ago. And so people, when we say people made so much stuff so much better in the past or whatever, it's like they literally didn't even have the option to make stuff so crappy as we have it today. And so they made it better. You know, obviously we should not ban or fear all technology, but that's, in my view, that's what the job of the government is. Like, this sucks. No, like, okay, just because we can doesn't mean we should. And so just because we can put red 40 in food doesn't mean we should. Like, red 40, it's like, there should be no red 40 tax, right? Red 40 is just banned, you know, illegal. Dunzo, no more. The European Union has done this, Canada has done this. And so, like, Fruit Loops in Canada are like pale, right? They're not brightly colored because they can't use synthetic food dyes. So that works. However, you know, more unintended consequences. A similar example of this happened with BPA, right? Everyone knows BPA is this toxic, bad plastic thing, bisphenol, whatever. And it's on receipts, it's in water bottles, it's in food packaging. So then people start realizing it's bad, and then they say, oh, no more BPA. And then people start saying, okay, we'll stop using BPA. Okay, this is BPA free. You can all calm down now. Well, what did they replace the BPA with? BPS. It's the real thing. Look it up. Or there's also others. Okay, ban BPS. Well, I can use BPC. Well, I ban BPC. Well, we're going to use BPB, right? Like, there's alternatives. So then when you start banning stuff, then this becomes another issue. You just invite new, like, alternatives that are technically different from the thing that you banned, but functionally the same. And then no progress is ever made, despite everyone thinking that progress is made. So that's a bad situation. And that's why, that's why banning stuff outright isn't fully effectual. What you need to do is something like the US, that the European Union does. And so, okay, so we have this thing in the FDA called GRAS, or generally recognized as safe. And so it's a chemical, a food additive, a packaging material, whatever. That's like, yep, we think this is safe. No one's ever said any problems have occurred from this. No one's ever proven that it's bad for you. So it's safe. That's it. You can claim that something that you invented is GRAS without even telling the FDA. Like, you just put it in your food. You can just do that. You can just put this new thing in your food. And then it only ever comes under scrutiny if people start complaining about it or studying it or whatever. And then after 5 years and dozens of studies, and of course you're trying to fund studies against this thing, and the manufacturer makes way more money, so they're going to fund studies that say it's safe, and you're going to fund studies that say it's bad. You know, maybe 10 years later you win, they remove the thing, and then, you know, it's just on to the latest one, onto the BPC, you know, like I said. So that doesn't work. But what does work is the European Union's model, where I forget what the formal term of it is, but instead of me having to prove that it's unsafe 10 years after the fact, before you ever even think about using it, you have to prove that it is safe first. And so instead of saying, oh, we'll just use BPZ, I don't know, making shit up. You can't just do that. You have to actually like take the time to scrutinize, just like any pharmaceutical, well, supposedly how it should work. You have to take the time to study its effects at a very rigorous level and prove that BPZ is okay before you're allowed to use it. And so the combination of the two, banning the bad stuff and establishing a much higher standard for acceptance of something as like being safe, instead of having its opponents prove that it's unsafe, you have its proponents prove that it is safe. If you do that, then actually you have a better shot. So for example, like in Europe, every food additive has a number. Once it goes through some study and formal review process, it gets a number. And then on the ingredients list, they list the number of the thing. And you can't use any ingredient unless it has undergone this process and has been assigned a number. I certainly think that the European Union approves too many things. There's certainly some unhealthy things that they do approve, but it's a far higher standard of, safety than what we have in the US, and it works pretty well for them.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So, Stephen, what do you think on more of a decentralized in the local food systems? Like, do you think that we can feed everybody that way, or do we have to rely on more of a centralized model that feeds, the metropolitan areas? And yeah. Before you answer, the reason that I go back and forth on this is because I tend to think, for the most part, I want to feed our community with food produced in our community, right? Yeah. Like, I think that that's long-term, like for health and for the local economy and everything. I think that's what we need to do the bulk of, right? But then there's also other things where that has to fill in the gap, especially if you're in a city of 3 million, right? Like, that's going to be hard to do. So, like, we work with, some of my friends like Gabe Brown and Alan Williams. They have done the Regenerative, right? And I think that certification is fantastic. It's cool. It gives you some more trust and more layers in there. But like, their thing is like, we want to help the scale, this larger scale, be trusted and to do things in the right way, especially on like the agricultural front.
Right.
So what are your thoughts there? It's like, are we going to have both? Or do you think that we can solve all the problems on the big scale?
Yeah. There's two lenses to looking at this. One is it physically possible? And two, how much does it cost? On the first point, yes, 100%. We can feed everyone locally. There are obviously some exceptions to this. You don't grow olives in Maine. And so if you want olive oil and you live in Maine, you're buying it from California at the closest, Italy, or Spain or something at the farthest. You want avocados, you live in Washington State, you're buying them from Mexico. They don't grow there. Sorry. It is what it is. However, all of the things that are the most important foodstuffs, which someone like you, I'm sure, is aware, beef, chicken, eggs, dairy, even your staple starches, potatoes, wheat, corn, whatever, all of that can be grown pretty much everywhere. In the same way that there are deer, there's black bears, for example, in like all 50 states, despite maybe not Hawaii, but despite the differences in climate and soil and, vegetation and forestry and whatever, there's black bears everywhere. There's deer freaking everywhere. Cows can survive everywhere. That certainly, it won't all be the same quality. For example, Florida's climate is not super well, especially South Florida is not super well suited toward beef production. But guess what? They have fish. They can do chicken. Chickens thrive in warm, tropically areas. They can, I actually don't know can they grow rice there? They grow a lot of fruit, right? So, I mean, I love to see like local diets, right? Like if you're in South Florida, I'm eating chicken, fish, and like citrus fruits because that's what's available. And I go up to Pennsylvania and I'm eating like dairy and potatoes because, that's what grows in Pennsylvania. This whole idea that we should expect that there's like a limited set of foods, 100 foods that are at the standard grocery store, and we should all expect all of them to be always available everywhere, every day of the year is insane. Totally bullshit, right? Why should I be able to buy bananas in New Jersey in the freaking winter? Tell me, please. Why should I do that? Why should I be able to buy fresh, wild caught, like Italian Mediterranean branzino in Illinois, like ever? But certainly like at every grocery store. Why? There's no need for this. And when you eat locally, it's better for you anyway, as we know, because like your body adapts based on the time of the year and your nutrient requirements change, right? During the summer months, it's better to have a higher sugar diet. And in the winter, it's better to have a high starch diet. So, I mean, our biology is already like keyed up to like work with the climate. Of course, there's another layer of like people living in climates that resemble where they evolved. I'm from my ancestors are from Southern Europe. And so my diet is going to be different than someone who's from Northern Europe or, obviously further, who lives in the same area as me. But at the very least, we can, more approximate like a local seasonal diet. And that's just like healthier, right? We should not be expecting avocados in Brooklyn in December. Sorry. Cut it out. No more avocado toast. Sorry, guys. So with that out of the way, yes, we can produce enough food locally pretty much anywhere, especially in America. America is like the most fertile country to ever like grace this planet. It's absurd how like we have twice the farmland per capita than the European Union does. Twice. And they're fine. And like they're known for having the best food in the world. So like if we have no excuse, basically, is what I'm trying to say. So the other thing I'll say about the physical possibility of this is that the centralized industrial monocrops, CAFO, factory farm food system is optimized for total profit dollars from a company that owns some piece of the system. It's not optimized for healthy calories per acre. Two very different optimizations, right? I was at a farm in northern Florida a few years ago, a regenerative farm, and the guy, he did pasture-raised beef, of course. But apparently he somehow was like learning about chestnuts and how like nutritious chestnuts are. And so he was like, well, I have this pasture land and it's actually in a valley. And so there's a lot of wind that rolls through here. And so it like is disturbing my whatever cattle. I forget why he didn't like the wind. So he's like, what if I just plant chestnut trees in my pasture? And so he did. And so there's like a few dozen chestnut trees in this little valley. And the diameter of a chestnut tree, like the area of a chestnut tree is like, what, like a few square feet at most? Like how much grass does it deprive that pasture of? Like basically nothing. But for one chestnut tree, he gets like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds of chestnuts a year. So it's like same land, same pasture, same beef output. And on top of it, he gets like thousands of pounds of chestnuts every year for free, right? It's like nature is so cool because you can stack things at different layers of the ecosystem that pull different nutrients and work in different ways, and they work together. And like the existence of the chestnut trees not only does not decrease the quality or quantity of grass, it probably increases it, right? Because then the chestnut trees have leaves and they fall and then it decomposes and then the cattle manure fertilizes the chestnut trees. And so you're literally getting more nutrients per acre than you did, even though it was just a pasture-raised beef farm prior to that. And so then imagine a world where, he goes further. Instead of just having cattle and you have the chestnuts, what if we then, after the cattle move through a pasture, and this is what regenerative farming is all about, you move the chicken herds. Thomas Massey has his little remote-controlled, movable chicken coop things. They're very cool. What if you move some of them in? And like now you have this pasture that you can't feed cows on because they already ate and pooped on it. But like there's a whole bunch of bugs and like little stuff and worms and whatever that the chickens can go in and eat. And they love that. And so now you get how many dozens, thousands of dozens of free eggs on the same land. You just added like a whole, 50% more nutrients per acre than you did when it was just the cattle and the chestnuts. So land, when managed creatively and on different dimensions, can produce an utter abundance of food, right? Like you see these things on Twitter all the time where it's like a food forest on 1 acre can produce enough food for an entire family for a year. It's just not done because that's not what we've been optimizing for. We've been optimizing for profit dollars per acre, which is best done when you have big rows of crops that are sprayed with pesticides and have your combine and have your drones. And I don't know, there's like 2 guys that harvest the entire field. That is what maximizes dollars to the entity that owns that farm. Because if they were to plant a food forest, right, it would require how many people in there in the weeds with how much knowledge that they have to learn and how much labor costs to like make the food, like make food out of that land. So if we can, so yeah, the point is that proper regenerative farming, permaculture, whatever you want to call it, is more productive per acre than any other farming system. And so if we're already feeding America plus some, because we export a lot of food with our available monocropped industrialized land, imagine how much more food we can make if we applied regenerative permaculture farming techniques to those same acres.
Yeah.
Because it's hard to manage, all these giant factory farms would kind of have to be split up, right? And so then you'd have a whole bunch of smaller farmers managing smaller plots of land who have more care and more attention and more, spiritual tie to the land, doing it more responsibly. It's like a win-win for everyone except like giant farming corporations. It's like winning for everyone except Cargill. We could probably feed the entire freaking planet, honestly. If every available acre of American land was farmed to this degree, we could feed the entire planet. I mean, even the suburbs, right? People like I mentioned, an acre of food can feed a whole family for a year. What if you had every acre of grass, instead of putting pesticides so your kids can play soccer and poison themselves while throwing a football around? Instead of doing that, what if you had a food forest in every suburban property? Not only would it look a lot better, like you'd be able to supply the suburban needs of like the suburban food needs with literally like doorstep local food. And then we have the farmland on top of it, and we can export that across the world, right? I honestly think you could either do it successfully or get very close to feeding the entire planet with just American land if it were managed in this way. Now, obviously, economics are real, and we have to consider like costs and time and opportunity costs, and like whether we have enough people to actually manage all this land in this way. Or even if we do, how much more expensive it'll be. And I'm sure it's not going to be cheaper. I will guarantee that, but who cares? How awesome would that be? I'd pay twice for I would be happy if my food bill doubled, tripled, whatever. I don't care. Like, that's so freaking cool. And so, yeah, it's totally physically possible. Financially, I'm sure there could be there'd be some losses, but you'd probably also have some wins because, you wouldn't have to pay transportation costs. You wouldn't have to pay for all this logistics. And yeah, so it can totally be done. Is my end of my long rambling answer.
No, I tend to agree. I think that lots of opportunities, lots of possibilities. You mentioned Thomas Massey. Him apparently going to be the new Secretary of Ag just absolutely tickles me. I just am beside myself with excitement. And then Joel Salatin being an advisor. I think that that's just absolutely incredible. And there's so many things, so many reasons to be excited.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, we can do so much more than we're currently doing. There's how many people are unemployed? Put them on a farm. Dude, come on. Easy. Problem solved. People who hate their office job, here, farm. There you go.
Love it.
Yeah, the other thing about the other difficulty, which is just worth mentioning, is helpful for people to think about, is that scaled, like a lot of the fake food stuff is done, like Beyond Meat is a good example. Why would the Beyond Meat raise billions of dollars? Obviously it's not doing very well today, but why would that even happen? If you can patent a thing, you get to be the only monopoly producer who makes that thing. And so meat is like a very large industry. I'm making up numbers, but let's say meat is a $100 billion industry in the US. All of that is divided up over tens of thousands of individual farmers, some big, some small, but it's still divided up. So maybe the wealthy, like Cargill, meat, and Carl's probably the biggest meat people. Maybe let's just say they're 50 billion of the meat market. And that's, I'm sure, an exaggeration. The reason why we'd want fake meat is because if you could replace all of the meat with it, then that would be your company who owns the entire market. So instead of having one Cargill who owns half of it and plus a bunch of other smaller folks, you get to own $100 billion market just for yourself. And so when you can patent stuff, you get to be a monopolist is basically the thinking. And so that's why you're going to see all these like fake oils, like the fermented non-seed oils, the algae oils, all this other bullshit, because it's a patented product that, instead of dividing up the seed oil market between 10 different companies, you can be the one company that sells all the oil in the country. Yeah. So there's obviously a lot of there's a lot of resistance to this by the monopolists, if you will. But that's kind of what the government's job is for, right? What about Rockefeller, Standard Oil, and the trust busting? Like, that's our whole thing. We break up monopolies. So yeah, I mean, there's immense power in the USDA, the FDA, and their associated organizations. And if they're wielded without bias and without compromise, we could absolutely change the whole agricultural setup and literally make everyone healthy again. Like, it's totally doable. It's just we need the people to do it who are free of compromise and other unsavory influences.
And entrepreneurs to take the risk and put the work in to make solutions come to market, right? Like, I think that's where you get a lot of kudos, brother, to do what you've done. I'm excited to be a partner in your journey, and we got a lot of work to do, though, but I am super excited and optimistic.
We certainly do. Appreciate it, Logan.
Thank you for joining us in the Sowing Prosperity mission. If you like this content, like and subscribe, share with your friends. Be sure to check out sowingprosperity.com. Sign up for the email. We've got so much more work to do.